I had just finished an 18-hour shift in the emergency room when my father erased me from his house. It was a little after 7 in the morning in Austin, Texas. My scrubs still smelled like antiseptic and adrenaline. I had stitched a scalp laceration at 2 in the morning. I had pushed epinephrine into a crashing patient at 4. I had told a woman her husband didn't make it just before sunrise. My hands had been steady for strangers all night. They started shaking when I turned onto Cedar Ridge Drive. 6 cardboard boxes sat on the front lawn. 2 black trash bags leaned against the mailbox. My framed medical degree was propped against the brick wall like something waiting for a price sticker. The grass was wet with morning dew, and the bottom corners of the boxes were already darkening. The brass lock on the front door caught the sunlight. It wasn't mine. My phone buzzed before I even reached the porch. "Your room is Ethan's now. Get your stuff. Don't cause a scene." I was 29 years old. I paid $1,450 in rent every month. By the weekend, a police officer would be standing on that same porch holding a stack of papers with my father's name printed across the top. But that morning, I just stood there, staring at the lock that told me I no longer existed. My name is Avery Collins. I'm a second-year emergency medicine resident at St. Gabriel Medical Center. 4 years earlier, after graduating from Baylor College of Medicine, I moved back into my childhood home because my father said it made financial sense. "Why waste money on strangers when you can help family?" Richard Collins had said, leaning back in his kitchen chair like he was offering me a gift. We didn't sign a lease. We shook hands. $1,450 a month, transferred through Zelle on the 1st. Every single time I typed the same word in the memo line: rent, 48 payments, 4 years. $69,600. I never missed a month. My younger brother, Ethan, lived in the room across the hall. He was 26 and called himself a real estate entrepreneur. Some months he closed deals. Some months he didn't. He never transferred $1,450 to anyone. Dad called that an investment in his future. I called it something else, but only in my head. 2 weeks before the lock change, I had come home from another overnight shift and found my father standing in my doorway with a tape measure. He wasn't startled to see me. He just rolled the metal strip back into its case slowly. "Thinking about reworking the layout," he muttered. "For what?" I asked. "Just upgrades." I had been too tired to push. Now my layout was stacked on the lawn. Mrs. Holloway from across the street paused mid-walk with her dog. Her eyes flicked from the boxes to me and back again. Curtains shifted in neighboring windows. Humiliation hit before anger did, not just being locked out, but being displayed. I tried my key anyway. It didn't turn. Another text came in. "You're almost 30. Time to be independent." Independent. As if I hadn't been working 80-hour weeks saving lives while transferring him $1,450 every month. As if I hadn't stocked the fridge between shifts. As if I hadn't listened to him complain about subcontractors over cold coffee at midnight. Within minutes, my phone started lighting up. "Aunt Lydia, your dad said you decided to move closer to the hospital. Proud of you, Cousin Mark. Finally taking that next step, huh?" I hadn't told anyone I was moving. He had already built the story. I sat down on the concrete step, still in my wrinkled scrubs, and opened my banking app. I typed his name into the search bar. Payment after payment appeared in neat green rows. January, February, March, year after year, rent, $69,600. That wasn't helping with utilities. That wasn't pitching in. That was tenancy. And if it was tenancy, then what he had just done wasn't tough love. It was an illegal lockout. I didn't pound on the door. I didn't call him back. I didn't cry in front of the neighbors. I lifted each box carefully, even the ones already damp at the bottom. I placed my degree flat across the back seat so the glass wouldn't crack. I closed the trunk gently. I drove back to the hospital parking garage because it was the only place that still felt like mine. By noon, I had screenshotted every single transaction. By sunset, I would learn something about tenant rights in Texas that my father clearly hadn't. He thought he had changed the locks on a bedroom. He had no idea he had just opened a case. I didn't sleep that day. I stayed in the hospital call room long after my shift officially ended, sitting on the cracked vinyl couch with my phone face down on my chest. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Monitors beeped faintly down the hall. I felt safer there, surrounded by controlled chaos, than I did on my father's quiet suburban street. The shock had worn off. What settled in its place was something colder. This wasn't impulsive. It was planned. My father didn't wake up that morning and decide to change the locks. He had measured my room 2 weeks earlier. He had repainted the hallway last month. He had already told the family I was moving out before I even knew it. My phone buzzed again. "Ethan, can you grab the rest of your stuff by Friday? I've got a desk being delivered." A desk. For the room I had paid nearly $70,000 to live in. I stared at his message and felt something click into place. This wasn't about space. It was about priority. Ethan had gotten engaged 3 months earlier. Madison posted 14 photos of the ring. Dad reacted to each one like his son had just won a national award. He started talking about legacy at dinner, about building something solid for the next generation. Meanwhile, I was working 80-hour weeks in the emergency department and transferring $1,450 into his account on the 1st of every month. Ethan didn't transfer anything. Dad called that temporary. "He's building momentum," he'd say. "Real estate takes time." 2 weeks before the lock change, I had walked into the kitchen around midnight after a shift and heard their voices low and tense. "I need a real office if I'm going to scale," Ethan said. "Clients don't take you seriously when you're working off a laptop in your bedroom." Dad replied, "We'll figure something out." I had been too exhausted to process it then. Now I understood exactly what "figure something out" meant. My phone lit up with a text from Aunt Lydia. "Your dad said you wanted independence. Good for you, Avery. About time." I felt my stomach tighten. I hadn't told anyone I was leaving. He was rewriting the narrative in real time, painting me as the ambitious daughter who had chosen to move closer to work. Independent, driven, mature. Not the daughter whose belongings had been placed on wet grass at 7 in the morning. I opened my banking app again in the cafeteria, scrolling back further this time. Year 1, Year 2, Year 3, Year 4, 48 transfers, rent, rent, rent. I typed his name into my text history. There it was, rent due by the 5th. Don't be late again. That message was from our 2nd year of the arrangement. If he called it rent then, he couldn't call it help now. That afternoon I drove back to the house to pick up the last of my things. The new desk had already been delivered. I could see it through the front window. Sleek black surface, centered under my old window. Mrs. Holloway was watering her flowers again. She lowered the hose when she saw me. "I heard you decided to move closer to the hospital," she said gently. "I didn't decide," I replied. She hesitated, then said, "Your father told everyone you stopped contributing." Stopped contributing. I almost laughed. I had contributed $69,600 over 4 years. I had paid more to live in my childhood bedroom than some of my co-residents paid for downtown apartments. I loaded the last box into my trunk and closed it quietly. I refused to slam it. I refused to give him a scene. As I pulled away from the curb, my phone buzzed again. "Ethan, don't make this bigger than it needs to be." I read the message twice. It was already bigger. Not because I wanted revenge, not because I wanted drama, but because the story he was telling about me was a lie. And lies only work when the other person stays silent. Elena found me in the call room just before sunset. I was sitting on the floor with my back against the couch, laptop open, banking app glowing on the screen. I had changed into fresh scrubs, but I still felt like I was wearing the morning. She closed the door behind her and didn't ask if I was okay. "Talk," she said. So I did. I told her about the boxes on the lawn, the new brass lock, the text message. The way my family had already decided I'd chosen independence. I told her the number, $69,600, 4 years, 48 payments, every memo line labeled rent. She didn't say I'm sorry, she said, "Did you pay him electronically?" "Yes." "Zelle." "What did you write in the memo?" "Rent." She held my gaze for a long second, then pulled out her phone. "My husband's going to want to hear this." Daniel Ramirez answered on the second ring. Elena put him on speaker. I suddenly felt like I was presenting a case report in residency, except this time I was the patient. He asked me 3 questions. "Did you have exclusive use of the bedroom?" "Yes." "Did you pay monthly in exchange for that use?" "Yes." "Did he give you 30 days written notice before changing the locks?" "No." Silence filled the room for a beat. "That's an illegal lockout," Daniel said finally. "Family doesn't override tenant law." The word illegal felt heavier than I expected. It shifted the morning from humiliation to violation. "But we didn't have a lease," I said. "You don't need one for a month-to-month tenancy," he replied. "Consistent monthly payments in exchange for exclusive possession establishes it." I looked at my screen again. 48 green check marks. "He changed the locks while I was on shift," I added quietly. "That strengthens your position," Daniel said. "No notice, no due process." Then he asked a question I hadn't considered. "Did your father report that rental income on his taxes?" I froze. "I don't know." "If he declared the property as primary residence only and never reported rental income, that's another issue," he said carefully. Another issue. 2 years ago, my father had refinanced the house. I remembered sitting at the kitchen table while he slid a document toward me. "It's just for the bank," he'd said. "States you're not a tenant. Standard stuff." "I am a tenant," I'd replied. He had laughed it off, but I never signed. That memory felt different now. Daniel laid out the plan in a voice that sounded almost clinical. Step 1, file an unlawful eviction complaint. Step 2, file small claims for the state cap, $15,000. Step 3, submit an IRS referral if there's unreported rental income. Documentation is your leverage. $15,000 wouldn't cover the full $69,600, but it would establish something more important. The record. After we hung up, I opened a new folder on my desktop. Case. I began saving everything. Screenshots of every Zelle transfer. Bank statements with deposits highlighted. Text messages referencing rent. I typed out a timeline from the day I moved in to the morning I found my degree on the lawn. At 8 that night, I called my father. He answered on the 3rd ring. "What?" he said. "I paid you rent for 4 years," I said evenly. "You helped with expenses." "You texted rent due by the 5th. Silence. "Don't twist words, Avery. That money was rent. That money was between us," he snapped. "It wasn't income." Between us. I glanced at my phone screen. The recording app had been running since the call connected. Texas was a one-party consent state. "You changed the locks without notice," I said. "You're almost 30. Grow up." He hung up. I stared at the recording file for a long moment before saving it into the folder. Case. 10 minutes later, Ethan posted an Instagram story, "New office space, new beginnings." The video panned slowly across the room. My old window, my old blinds, the wall where my degree had hung. I closed the app. The courthouse opened at 8:30 in the morning. For the first time since the lock changed, my hands felt steady again. I didn't cry that night. I sat on the edge of Elena's guest bed with my laptop balanced on my knees and built a file instead. 48 Zelle transactions. I downloaded each receipt and renamed them in order. January, year 1. February, year 1. All the way through the most recent transfer, sent 5 days before my father changed the locks. Every memo line said the same thing: rent. I highlighted the word until it almost glowed on the screen. Then I pulled up our text history. I searched the word rent. It appeared more times than I expected. Rent due by the 5th. Don't forget rent. You're late on rent. There was no ambiguity in those messages, no suggestion I was just helping out, no casual language about utilities or groceries. At 11:30, my phone buzzed with a notification from the family group chat. Ethan had shared a photo. The caption read, "Office setup coming together. Grateful for family support." The image showed the black desk centered beneath my old window, fresh paint, new shelving. The wall where my residency certificate had hung was bare. My chest tightened, but not from sadness, from clarity. He wasn't hiding it. They assumed I would stay quiet. Another message followed from my aunt. "So proud of how this family comes together for milestones." Milestones. I typed a response 3 times and deleted it 3 times. There was no point arguing in a thread already shaped against me. Instead, I checked my email. There it was. A forwarded message from my father to extended family, time-stamped 2 hours before he changed the locks. "Avery's decided it's time to move closer to work. We're proud of her independence." He had written the story before he removed the key. I stared at the timestamp for a long moment. This was not a reaction, it was a strategy. I called Ethan. He answered immediately. "What?" he said. "You knew he was changing the locks. It's Dad's house." "I paid rent." "You helped with bills." He called it rent. "You were planning to leave anyway," Ethan shot back. "Don't act surprised." "I never said that." There was a pause, then a shrug in his voice. "That's what Dad told everyone." So that was the narrative. I had outgrown the house. I had chosen freedom. I had taken the noble step toward independence, not been forced into it by a new lock and a public display. After we hung up, my mother called. Her voice was softer, cautious. "Can't you just talk to him?" I tried. "You know how your father is." "Yes," I said, "I do." She hesitated. "Did you really call a lawyer?" "I asked questions." "Don't make this public, Avery. It'll humiliate him." I closed my eyes. "Did you know he was changing the locks?" Silence, long enough to answer. "I thought he'd talk to you first," she whispered. "But you knew." Another silence. That was confirmation. I hung up gently and opened the Travis County website. I downloaded the unlawful eviction complaint form and filled in the blanks carefully. Petitioner, Avery Collins. Respondent, Richard Collins. Seeing our last name twice on the same page made my pulse spike. It looked wrong. It looked permanent. I attached my evidence list to the draft. 48 rent payments, text messages referencing rent, timeline of lock change without notice. Daniel texted me the filing fee amount and the address for the courthouse. "Meet me at 8:20. I saved the document and stared at the cursor blinking beside my father's name. Once filed, it would be public record. No more private negotiations, no more family-only conversations. The law didn't care about Thanksgiving dinners or shared last names. It cared about facts. My phone buzzed again. Ethan had posted another story. "Family is everything." I looked at the words and felt something settle inside me. By this time tomorrow, that sentence would sound different. I clicked save, closed my laptop, and set an alarm for 7. The locks had already changed. Now the paperwork would. The courthouse smelled like old paper and disinfectant. I arrived at 8:20 sharp, with a manila envelope tucked under my arm, and my hair still damp from a rushed shower. Downtown Austin was already warming under the morning sun, but inside the Travis County building, everything felt fluorescent and cold. Daniel met me near the security line. "You ready?" he asked. "I'm not here to argue," I said. "I'm here to document." He nodded once. At the clerk's window, I laid everything out carefully. 48 Zelle transactions printed in order, bank statements with deposits highlighted, text messages referencing rent, a typed timeline of the day my father changed the locks without notice. The clerk, a woman with reading glasses sliding down her nose, flipped through the pages slowly. "Consistent monthly payment," she murmured. "And no written notice?" "No, ma'am." She stamped the unlawful eviction complaint first. The mechanical thud echoed louder than it should have. Then she stamped the small claims petition for $15,000, the maximum allowed in this court. Petitioner, Avery Collins. Respondent, Richard Collins. Seeing the official seal pressed into paper made it real in a way screenshots never could. You'll receive a hearing date by mail, she said. Service will be handled through the sheriff's office. Service. The word landed heavily. By 9:15, the case was filed. Public record, permanent. I went straight from the courthouse to the hospital and worked a full shift. I placed IV lines. I charted vitals. I delivered discharge instructions with the same steady voice I used every day. At 9:14 the next morning, my phone rang in the supply closet. Daniel. They served him. How? Sheriff's deputy, 9 o'clock sharp. I pictured it before he finished explaining. Cedar Ridge Drive. Mid-morning light. My father in the driveway. Ethan's fiancée Madison's white SUV parked beside the garage. Mrs. Holloway watering her flowers across the street. A marked patrol car pulling up slow. The deputy stepping out, uniform crisp, stack of papers in hand. Richard Collins? The deputy would have said. Yes? You've been served, Daniel continued, his tone calm. He read through the first page and sat down on the porch step. I closed my eyes for a second. The same porch where my boxes had been lined up. What did Ethan do? I asked. Apparently started asking questions. Loudly. Within an hour, my phone began vibrating nonstop. Ethan called first. What did you do? He demanded. I filed what's legal. You sent the sheriff to our house. I didn't send anyone, I filed paperwork. You're embarrassing us. He embarrassed himself when he changed the locks. He hung up before I finished the sentence. 5 minutes later, my mother called. Her voice was shaky. The sheriff came in front of Madison, she whispered. And Mrs. Holloway was outside. I know. Can't you withdraw it? It's filed, Mom. There's nothing to withdraw. She started crying softly. Your father is furious. Furious. That word used to scare me. Now it felt smaller. Around noon, a notification popped up in the Cedar Ridge Homeowners Association Facebook group. Anyone know why a deputy was at the Collins residence this morning? The comments started filling in quickly. Hope everything's okay. That didn't look routine. Civil papers, maybe? By mid-afternoon, Ethan's Instagram story of his new office disappeared. In its place, a generic quote appeared. Family first. I almost laughed. Daniel called again that evening. Statutory penalties may apply if the judge confirms illegal lockout, he said. And just so you know, we submitted the IRS referral this morning. My grip tightened on the phone. Already? Yes. Documentation was strong. While my father was flipping through small claims papers on his porch, another file had been time-stamped in a federal database. 2 tracks moving at once. That night, my father finally texted me. You've crossed a line. I stared at the words for a long time. Then I typed back, You changed the locks first. I didn't add anything else. The court date was circled on my calendar in red, and for the first time since I saw my degree on the lawn, I felt something unfamiliar. Not fear, momentum. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Second floor, fluorescent lights, rows of wooden benches polished smooth from years of anxious hands. I sat at the petitioner's table with a 3-ring binder in front of me, tabs labeled in neat black ink. Rent payments, text messages, timeline, recording transcript. Across from me, my father sat alone. No attorney, no legal pad, just a folded copy of the complaint and a jaw set tight enough to crack. Ethan sat behind him, arms crossed, staring at the back of my head like I had personally insulted him by showing up. My mother sat beside him, clutching her purse to her chest, as if it could float her out of the room. Daniel took a seat in the gallery. He wasn't allowed to represent me in small claims, but he had helped me rehearse. Facts, he'd said. Stay with facts. The judge entered promptly at 9. Case number, the clerk called. Collins versus Collins. Hearing our last name twice in the same sentence felt strange, but I didn't look back. Miss Collins, the judge said, adjusting her glasses, you may present your case. I stood. For 4 years, Your Honor, I paid $1,450 per month to my father for exclusive use of a bedroom in his home, I began. 48 consecutive payments, all labeled rent. On the morning of May 11th, he changed the locks without written notice and placed my belongings outside. I handed up the first exhibit. The judge flipped through the Zelle receipts slowly. Page after page, rent, rent, rent. "Mr. Collins," she said, turning to my father, "did your daughter pay you this amount monthly?" "She contributed to household expenses," he replied stiffly. "Did you refer to those payments as rent?" He hesitated. The judge lifted a printed text message and read it aloud. "Rent due by the 5th. Don't be late again." The silence that followed felt heavy. "You used the term rent," she said evenly, "and you accepted consistent monthly payment in exchange for exclusive use of space. That establishes tenancy." "It's my house," my father said, voice rising slightly. "She's my daughter." "And tenants can also be family members," the judge replied. "The law does not distinguish." She turned back to me. "Did Mr. Collins provide you with 30 days written notice to terminate tenancy?" "No, Your Honor." She looked at my father again. "Did you provide written notice?" "No," he muttered. "And you changed the locks while she was away?" "Yes." The judge nodded once and made a note. "Changing locks without proper notice constitutes unlawful eviction under Texas law," she said. "This court recognizes the tenancy relationship." My father shifted in his seat. "This is family business," he insisted. "She's blowing it out of proportion." "It became court business when you performed an illegal lockout," the judge said calmly. "Intent does not negate statute." She reviewed the documents one final time. "In light of the evidence, I am ruling in favor of the petitioner," she announced. "Mr. Collins is ordered to pay $15,000, the statutory maximum for small claims in this jurisdiction, plus applicable penalties for unlawful lockout." My mother let out a small sound behind me. Ethan swore under his breath. My father stared straight ahead, expression frozen. The judge continued. "Miss Collins, you retain the right to pursue additional damages in civil court for amounts exceeding this cap." I nodded. Judgment entered. The gavel struck once. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, it was final. Outside the courtroom, my father approached me in the hallway. "You've humiliated this family," he said quietly. "I asked for notice," I replied. "You changed the locks." "This will affect Ethan's business," he added. "I didn't put a deputy in your driveway," I said. "You did." He looked at me like he wanted to say something more, but nothing came out. As he walked away, Daniel stepped beside me. "You handled that well," he said. "What happens next?" I asked. "The check clears, and the IRS referral is already in motion." I exhaled slowly. The courtroom had been public, quick, visible. The next part would be quieter and heavier. 6 weeks after the hearing, my mother called me twice in a row. I was sitting in my car in the hospital parking garage, still in scrubs, staring at the steering wheel. She never called twice unless something was wrong. I answered on the third ring. "Avery," she said, her voice tight. "Something came in the mail today." I already knew. "From who?" "The Internal Revenue Service." The words landed exactly the way Daniel said they would. Plain white envelope, federal return address, 4 tax years under review. "Your father says it's routine," she continued, but even she didn't sound convinced. "Is it?" I asked. There was a pause. "They're asking for documentation," she admitted. "Bank statements, deposits. They're comparing reported income to transfers." Transfers. $69,600 over 4 years. My father had called that money between us. Apparently, the government didn't agree. That night, he called me himself. His voice was controlled, but the edges were worn down. "The IRS opened an audit," he said without greeting. "They're questioning deposits." "I see. They're saying there's unreported income." Silence stretched between us. "How much?" I asked. "They're estimating over $30,000 with penalties and interest." The number felt abstract for a moment. Larger than the $15,000 judgment, larger than the mortgage payments he used to complain about at dinner. "You didn't have to take it this far," he said. "You changed the locks," I replied. "You could have handled it privately." "You handled it publicly when you put my things on the lawn." He didn't apologize. He didn't say he was wrong. He just exhaled sharply and hung up. Within days, the ripple effect started showing. He hired a CPA immediately, thousands in retainer fees, boxes of paperwork stacked on the dining room table where I used to drink coffee before early shifts. Ethan called me late one evening. "Did you really report Dad to the IRS?" he demanded. "I submitted documentation." "You've put him under a microscope." "He put me on the lawn." There was silence on the line, heavier this time. One of Ethan's real estate clients backed out of a listing after Googling the family name and finding the small claims case, public record, petition and judgment available to anyone who searched. Madison's parents requested a financial clarification meeting. The wedding venue deposit was delayed. The Cedar Ridge HOA group quieted. My father, once loud in meetings, stopped posting about landscaping standards and driveway compliance. Reputation doesn't collapse overnight. It erodes. The small claims check cleared into my account the same week the audit letter arrived. $15,000. Court-ordered, traceable, real. I stared at the deposit for a long moment before transferring most of it into savings. Not revenge. Reconstruction. My mother visited my apartment once, standing in the doorway like she wasn't sure she was allowed inside. "It's peaceful here," she said softly. "It is." She looked older than she had 6 weeks earlier. "I didn't think he'd change the locks," she admitted. "I thought he'd talk to you." "You knew." Her eyes dropped. "I didn't think it would go this far." "It didn't go far," I said. "It went legal." She nodded slowly, like she was beginning to understand the difference. 3 days later, my father called again. "The CPA says if this escalates, it could impact my construction loan," he said flatly. I didn't respond. "I built that house," he added, as if that fact alone erased what he had done. "And I paid to live in it," I said. He didn't argue. For the first time in my life, I heard something in his voice that wasn't authority. Uncertainty. When we hung up, I opened my laptop and searched apartment listings again. Within 10 miles of the hospital. Under $1,100 a month. Ground floor preferred. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was rebuilding. 6 weeks earlier, I had been standing on wet grass with my belongings at my feet. Now I was choosing square footage based on commute time and natural light. The IRS audit would take months to resolve. The family fallout might take longer, but something fundamental had shifted. He changed the locks. I changed the leverage. 3 months after the locks were changed, I signed a lease with my name alone on every page. The apartment was nothing dramatic. 1 bedroom, ground floor, 12 minutes from St. Gabriel Medical Center if traffic cooperated. The rent was $1,050 a month, $400 less than what I had paid my father to live in my childhood bedroom. When I picked up the keys, the property manager slid them across the desk and said, "Welcome home." No handshake, no family discount, no emotional negotiation, just a contract. The first night I slept there, the silence felt different. It wasn't the tense quiet of trying not to upset someone. It wasn't the careful quiet of staying out of my father's way. It was simple, neutral, mine. The $15,000 judgment cleared the same week I moved in. I used part of it for first and last month's rent, the security deposit, and a mattress that didn't sag in the middle. The rest went into an emergency fund under my name only. I hung my medical degree above my small desk, straight and centered. No one measured the wall, no one suggested moving it, no one needed the space for a better investment. One Sunday evening, my phone rang. Dad. I almost didn't answer. Not out of anger, out of clarity. "Whitney," he stopped himself. "Avery." His voice was flatter than I'd ever heard it. "The IRS says it'll be over $30,000 by the time penalties are done," he said. "The CPA thinks we might have to restructure some things." I leaned back against my kitchen counter and looked around my apartment. I'm sorry you're dealing with that, I said honestly. You went too far. You changed the locks, I replied. Silence stretched between us. I was trying to do right by your brother, he said finally, by doing wrong by me. He didn't argue with that. He didn't apologize either. All right, he said after a long pause, and ended the call. It was the first time in my life that all right sounded like surrender. Ethan's wedding was postponed. Officially, it was for logistical reasons. Unofficially, lenders and future in-laws tend to ask questions when audits and court judgments show up in public searches. My mother visited once. She stood in my doorway and took in the small living room, the neat kitchen table, the quiet. It feels peaceful here, she said again. It is. She nodded, as if she was learning a language she had never been taught. Some people asked me later if it was worth it. If filing the complaint, pursuing small claims, and submitting documentation to the IRS had been worth the fallout. Here's what I know. Keeping receipts is not revenge. Knowing your tenant rights is not betrayal. Setting boundaries with family is not cruelty. Silence protects the person in power. Documentation protects the person who pays. I used to believe that if I worked harder, gave more, complained less, my father would eventually look at me the way he looked at Ethan. Now I understand something different. You don't earn equality in a system that depends on your obedience. You establish it. Tonight I'm sitting at my own kitchen table. The lamp is on. The apartment is quiet. I lock my front door before bed, and the sound is solid and uncomplicated. The locks are mine now. So let me ask you something. If you had been in my place, would you have kept the peace for the sake of family? Or filed the papers and let the law speak for you? Comment court if you believe in documentation and boundaries. Comment peace if you think family should stay private no matter what. And if this story felt familiar, if you've ever been the one who paid more, gave more, and stayed quiet, stay with this channel. There are more stories like this, and sometimes hearing them is the first step toward building your own boundary. I'll see you in the next one. This narrative is dramatized for storytelling impact.